Good day, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lilly with the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled The Role of Fundamentals and Policy in New Zealand's Carbon Prices. We are grateful to Ling Liao from the University of Otago, New Zealand for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues amongst professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find on our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our speaker. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question. We have allocated time at the end of the webinar to read and answer them. And now, I would like to introduce our speaker, Ling Liao. She is currently a PhD candidate at the Climate and Energy Finance Group, University of Otago, New Zealand. Her current research interests include asset pricing, climate finance, carbon markets, and energy finance. Ling, over to you.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for this opportunity to present my paper. Let me just share my screen. All right. I guess you can all see it.
It's perfect.
Okay, great, awesome. So yeah, thank you everyone again. This paper is based on my past master paper and the topic on the role of fundamentals and policy in New Zealand's carbon prices. And my co-authors are Dr. Ivan, Sebastian, and Domina. They're my supervisors as well when I was doing this paper. So if you want to leave now, actually there's a key takeaway statement from this paper, and that is the fundamental drivers of New Zealand prices imply some important policy related issues. And this is around the carbon market linking, and the over-allocation to some sectors. Oh, sorry. And then the motivation of this paper is really from the statement from Ministry for the Environment, MFE, in 2019 and Stevenson et al. In 2017. The statement is that New Zealand units, NZUs, price is set by unit supply and demand. So the NZU is the name of New Zealand's domestic emission scheme, and 1 NZU is equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that means that other major greenhouse gases are also priced. And so in theory, it's often the case of price is set by supply and demand, but in reality, it is really so. So this just leads to my research question. Does the balance between units demand and supply from sectoral economic activities determine carbon prices in the New Zealand Emission Trading Scheme, or the NZ ETS? And the NZ ETS is the name of New Zealand's carbon market and is a key tool for meeting the domestic and international climate change targets, which I'll explain in detail later how it works. Figure 1 gives a good idea about the movement of the carbon returns. And so it's the NZU price, spot price movement from July 1st, 2010 to December 31st, 2019. So from this simple graph, there's actually gives some information regarding the first is it actually depicts 2 stages of the NZ ETS. So if you can see, let me use the pointer. If you can see the state here, before May 31st, 2015, that's a linking period, which means that the NZ ETS is fully linked to the international carbon market, the Kyoto market. And so in this phase, the participants can use international unit to meet their obligation. So if you imagine in your market, it can be likened to a currency market. You are fully welcome all the foreign currency to come to your market. So this is the period of time, very special period of time. However, you can see that it didn't work out that well if fully open to the international market. So as you can see, actually suffered a plunge from here. And then, the government made an announcement actually around the end of 2012, and they're saying they're gonna de-link from this international market. So, and the true-up period is till May 31st, 2015. So after that, the NZ ETS has been effectively running as a domestic market. So only NZUs allowed in this market here for obligation and for trading. And interestingly, also actually this year, there's so much going on in this NZ ETS now that early this year, an auction mechanism was also introduced in March 2021. And so if you look at the price here, another thing to highlight is at the end of 2019, the end price is 28 New Zealand dollars and 50 cents. And by the end of 2020, the price already rose to $37.55. So that's after a year, that's 32% increase. And so I also checked the price yesterday. It was New Zealand dollars, $64.70. So what it means here is that after 10 months, there was a 72% increase for NZU price. And sort of you see from during the pandemic period is probably the best, if we could invest, probably it's the best investment instrument. It's so resilient. So the question is, some of you may ask, is this price high enough for achieving the targets? Well, it will be very interesting to look in the future, but just putting it out here that, well, according to the World Bank's 2020 report, to achieve the Paris Agreement temperature goals, the minimum carbon price should fall within the range of New Zealand dollars, $58 to $118 by 2020. And by 2030, the price range shall fall within 72.50 cents and $145. So this just gives you an idea. Well, it doesn't mean anything, but just give you an idea about the price movement for now. So in terms of my contribution, firstly is definitely to the literature. Even though NZ ETS is second oldest carbon market in the world, but there is pretty scarce literature contributed to the NZ ETS. And so there are some gray literature and the reports from think tanks, but the findings, they are backed neither by in-depth quantitative evidence nor an extensive investigation on both supply and demand drivers. So for doing such a research will also be beneficial to the New Zealand policymakers for them to assess the effectiveness and efficiency of the market mechanism. And as I pointed out earlier, this is really a key tool for the government to reach the targets. And after such an assessment, they can know where to improve and how to improve this market tool. And to these policymakers in other countries, I think it's really a good case study for them to learn because as I will point it out later, the NZ ETS has many interesting characteristics. So especially for those sharing the similar geography, geology, emission profiles, and climate risk, and for those who are considering enrolling carbon sink into the carbon market, and for those who are considering linking their carbon market to the international market, all this because the NZ ETS has experienced all this, or both of has experienced all this, or they are still experiencing now. Like forest sector is a very important sector in the emission profile of New Zealand. And to the market participant, for the market participant here, they can definitely gain a lot of insight on what drives New Zealand prices. And accordingly, they probably can devise some hedging strategy to hedge against the NZU price volatilities. So this is the structure of my presentation. I probably will spend some sufficient time to explain just the New Zealand context, mainly the emissions profile and the NZ ETS. And then I'll briefly go over theory, hypothesis, the data we gathered, methodology we use, and then I'll also go through some key results, not all results, but just some highlights, and I'll conclude from there. So the New Zealand context. So first, it would be very helpful to see New Zealand's emissions profile. This figure it gives depicts the New Zealand's emission breakdown by sector in year 2017. So from the left-hand side, from the left to the right, there is a LUCF, that's the land use change, and forestry. Actually, in this block here, as we will see later, forestry sector occupies a chunk of space here. And to the right is agriculture that accounts for, is 48% according to this year's data. So you can see that agriculture is really a main issue for New Zealand here. But unfortunately, currently the agriculture sector is not enrolled in the NZ ETS yet. There's a lot of lobbying going on. There has been a lot of lobbying and then consultation going on. And but then the latest policy announced that they will be enrolled by 2025. And then to the right here, this energy sector. And we'll see, as we'll see later as well, there are some subsectors involved in this whole block. And we will talk more in detail later. And these are mainly in our paper, we're mainly looking at the energy sector, the whole block here, and the LUCF, or mainly the forestry sector in our paper here. So this figure is just an emission breakdown within the energy sector in year 2017. And so this quite interesting here, the big block here is actually from transport sector. So unlike many other OECD countries, many other countries, the main task or the task priority for them is in the energy sector or the station energy generation sector. But for New Zealand, however, the top priority would be the transportation sector. And we've already seen a lot going on in terms of promoting EV, electric vehicles, and so that's kind of makes sense here because that's the top priority for us. And for emission, you may wonder how come the emission, the energy stationary energy sector contributed so little, relatively little. That's because in New Zealand, it's a highly, I would say, it utilizes the renewable energy highly. So in fact, 85% of our energy mix comes from the renewable energy. And a lot of them is from the hydropower. And then the third block, which we will be looking at later, is the manufacturing industry and construction sector. And this sector will also point out later some policy policy in this country, the effect or how the policy can affect the sector. So this one just again kind of pinpoint what I said earlier, that is a breakdown within the land use change and forestry sector. So you can see a huge block here is the forest land. And that just tells the significance of the forestry sector in New Zealand, of this sector, how the role they play in our emission trading scheme. Okay, with following that, I will do an overview or introduction about the New Zealand emission trading scheme. So the NZ ETS was established in 2008. As I said, it's the second oldest national scheme, following the European emission trading scheme. The graph here, I grabbed it from the MFE, Ministry for Environment website. I think they updated with another video. I checked it last night. But this one gives a simple but view regarding how it works here during just the examination period we're discussing about here. So basically on the left-hand side is all the is about the demand side. So these companies from stationary energy, from manufacturing, from construction, from transport, and other smaller sectors, when they conduct their business, they will make emissions. So after a year, they need to pay this NZUs to the government for however much emission they made in the previous year. And then on the right-hand side here, it's the supply side. Mainly, gives you an idea. It's a forestry sector plays a very important role here. So every year, the government will pay those foresters with NZUs, for however much carbon or the emission they can absorb. So this just this mechanism form a trading here, because for the demand side, from the sectors, the demand side, in order to get NZUs, if they don't have enough NZUs, then they need to pay those suppliers and for these NZUs so that they can have enough NZUs to surrender to the government and to be compliant to meet their obligations. So this is a very simple graph. However, in actual life, the mechanism is reasonably complicated. I would say it's not the most complicated one, as I've kind of also looked into other markets. But so for the demand side, it's quite straightforward. It's just the different sectoral activities that will have emissions. But on the right-hand side, or the supply side, there are actually different sources of supply. So there is the supply, one is called allocation, and this allocation is from the government. It's either one-off allocation or ongoing allocation, depending on which sector you're from. And there's also the entitlements as another source of supply. And this entitlements is or they call it allowance return. These units are given to those participants who can absorb the carbons, absorb the emissions. So inevitably, the foresters will benefit from this this part, but also there's a small part that's dedicated for those who can export synthetic gases. So that's the entitlements. And then there's also the international unit, as that's typically during the linking period, when the participant could use the international units to surrender to be compliant. And so that stopped, the supply kind of stopped after May 2015. And then the fourth source of supply is called banked units, or in some news or the literature, they call it private stockpile units. So what this means here is that the participants, they at one point, they buy a whole lot and they put it in their private bank. They hold on to it. They don't use it all at once. They put it in their private bank, expecting to use them in the future. So as you may kind of imagine, it plays as it's a no real supply, but it's like a short-term supply for them. So it's a very interesting thing, a variable to look at, because now actually in the ETS, it's being a big issue around here. The private stockpile has grown too large, and the government, we need to think about a way to how to reduce the volume there to really achieve a emission reduction. And fixed price option, or FPO, I put a question mark here just because it doesn't really, okay, let me explain this here. The fixed price option is when the participants come to an obligation. They, instead of submitting the real NZU, the units, they can also pay the government for a certain amount of money to be still considered compliant. So before 2020, the price fixed at $25, and earlier before that, it was lower. During 2020, the price increased to $35. And so I wouldn't say it's a direct source of supply, but it does facilitate, however, the participants' banking behavior, because if they see that the market price for NZU or even international unit, when the international unit was available, if they see the price is higher than $25 or however much the FPO price is, then they would rather pay FPO than buy from the market, the units. And they also, that won't touch their the banked units, the units in their private stockpile. So it's a vehicle for them to actually facilitate their banking. So the whatever they bank still stays in their bank. They won't use the banked units the bank units to be compliant. And then, so why do we study the NZ ETS? Because it's very unique. So the first, I hope you probably have some impression about what I presented earlier, that the NZ ETS, at least during my examining period of time, is an incentive system. There's no hard emissions cap during this period. And so it's also an upstream obligation. It's the broadest sector. It has the broadest sectoral coverage in the world. And if you can see on the right-hand side here, there's the diagram here just gives you a comparison, good comparison among those carbon markets. And then New Zealand is sitting here, although, it covers many more sectors than other carbon markets. And then here, the unlimited, this chunk here just kind of tells you the specifics specs of this mechanism. For the NZUs, for the NZ ETS, it has an unlimited import unit period from the beginning to May 2015, I mentioned earlier, and unlimited banking provision from the beginning even till now, which still remains a big issue. And then there's 142 transitional units obligation measure from 2009 to 2018. What does 142? This 142 is, so when a participant come to meet their obligations for a period of time, so from 2009 to 2018, they instead of actually it's from 2009 to 2016, for every 2 tons of emissions they make, they only need to submit 1 unit. So that means effectively they only have 50% of obligation. And from 2017, however, the government started to phase down this 142 measures. So, and from 2019, they started to have real 141 obligation. And fixed price option, that's something also very unique here, as I mentioned earlier. So it started from 2009 to 2020. So they only need to pay a price, they don't need to surrender any units. And in 2021, when the auction kicked in, this provision was ruled out. Forestry's roles, just to give you an idea, the stats about this role as a carbon sink, 27.5% of NZU gross total emissions is from forestry sector. And that means they can absorb this much of emissions. And then agriculture, as I mentioned earlier before, they are to be enrolled in by 2025. And that accounts for 48% of New Zealand's emissions. And I'll quickly go through the theory and hypothesis. So our theory is very basic economic principle. So supply and demand determine the price. So before delink or during the linking period, the supply curve is here. However, after delink, because there's no more international supply, the supply shrank to this curve. And we just assume that it's a very conceptual graph, and assume that demand remain fixed here. But of course, in reality, it will fluctuate, it will change. But let's just assume that demand stay fixed here. And then due to the supply, the shrinking of the supply, the price will go up. And this is testified by the pricing figure we saw at the beginning in figure 1. There's an NZU price mile. So the price plunge, but then it increased after delink. And then this is just literature part. This literature review really guide me to find appropriate proxies for the demand and supply drivers. So mainly the energy prices, how renewable is going to affect the carbon prices, the climate factors, the banking behaviors, international units, and something around the forestry sector. And these bottom 2 are really about the policy effect on NZU prices. So the policy really plays an important role there. So that just kind of leads to our 4 hypotheses. The first hypothesis, H1, is about the structural breaks. So we expect there are 4 structural breaks. That means the price return structural break following 4 policy events. One is the Kyoto Protocol withdrawal announcement, and one is a large ban on this low integrity international units. And third is fulfillment of this period 1 true-up period. And the last one is 142 transitional measure phasing out announcement. So the first 3, they're really about the supply side. They all affect supply and international supply. And the last one is a demand side, domestic demand, because now effectively they have to submit 1-for-1 1 emission, submit 1 unit for 1 ton emission they had in the previous year. So they need to have more, effective more units to meet their obligation. H2 is from our supply side. So domestic supply that includes allocation and entitlement, and net import should negatively affect NZU price return. H3, the banked allowance and negative effect NZU price return. As I mentioned earlier before, that bank units placed as a short-term source of supply. So it should have a negative effect on NZU price return. H4 is on the demand side. Those subsectors, their demand for the emission allowances should positively related to NZU price return. So the subsectors are the transportation, manufacturing, construction, and energy sector, or stationary energy sector. So my data methodology, quickly go over. Sorry for this busy table, but it just shows you how extensive our analysis are. So these few rows, they are from the pricing, they are pricing proxies, and the generation, this electricity generation, the storage is capturing the hydropower, the storage, and net import, that's the variable of interest, a bank unit, and DS, domestic supply, entitlement, allocation, these are all our variable for interest, the supply, and these are supply. And then, so we also include those climate factors, the extreme hot days, extreme cold days, and temperature anomalies, absolute mean temperature. And the bottom part here, they're from the demand side, capturing the demand drivers. So manufacturing, the manufacturing values after D-link, the construction values and construction values after D-link, and transport, that's travel emissions. And so this is just a methodology. In order to test the structural breakpoints, we use Xavier-Andrew test, but however, I also conducted some other robust tests. That's Wold test and iterated cumulative sums of squares algorithm following the literature. And to identify relationships, I used econometric tools. These are the models here that I employed. So key results, there are just some highlights of the results. So the table 1 here presents our results that related to the first hypothesis, and that's the policy event, the price, mainly the price shock from the policy event so we have found 2 breakpoints. One is on the February 19th, 2013, and is very likely is because of a large ban on international units with low environmental integrity. And then the second breakpoint is on June 21st, 2016, and is likely due to the announcement of gradual phasing out of 142 transitional measure. So you can see that one is really from the supply side, there's some price shock from the supply side, and there's some price shock from the demand side policy event. And then this table pretty much is telling what I was saying earlier. And then our results of the robust test also agree with our findings. And so this table, it presents the daily effects of demand and supply drivers that's related to second, third, and fourth hypothesis. So that's the supply and demand drivers. So there are mainly five columns here. So model 1 here actually presents the results for the full sample period. And model 2 and model 3 are estimated using subsample periods motivated by the official dealing date. And the official dealing date is May 31st, 2015. Model 4 and model 5 are estimated using the subsamples motivated by the actual dealing date. Why we say there is an actual dealing date is because when we look into the registry, we found that, that even though officially the dealing date is at the end of May 2015, but from June to November, mid-November, there were still some units or the transactions in the registry registry file. So accordingly, we did analysis the breaking of periods according to a official dealing date and then kind of the actual dealing date. So highlights here is corresponding to our domestic supply and international supply hypothesis. That's the second hypothesis. We found that after the official dealing date, that's May 31st, 2015, the domestic supply has a negative effect. So before that, the effect was not significant. For the international unit, the source of supply from international market, before the actual dealing date, it has a negative effect. And we can see that there's a boost. So it's here, the significance is magnified here. There's a boost between the official and actual dealing date. So it's quite interesting here to see that before the dealing or during the linking period, NZU prices was largely driven by international market price. So it can be a good, I guess, lesson to be learned from other policymakers, especially for the smaller market, to consider when they want to implement this linking, what may happen, how much caution they need to take. So come to H3, we found that H3 is related to the banked units. We found that the banked units, very interestingly, it has a negative effect, significant negative effect only between the official and actual dealing dates. Even though currently there's a lot of discussion about the private stockpile, how it keeps increasing and the volume never goes down, or it just keeps increasing. So there could be a potential issue in the future there. But so here during this period, our examining period just only see is during this period that becomes significant. And that's probably kind of just tells you a crowding effect happened around that. Oh, sorry, yeah, so it's just very interesting to see here. only affect during this time. So probably afterwards, many participants, they just want to keep banking. They don't actually use that many banked units and put it into the market and let it to play as a real source of supply to them. So the last one linked to our fourth hypothesis related to our demand drivers. So what it shows here is that after the official delink date, these the electricity price return has a negative effect on NZU return. This is quite interesting here. First is the timeline, and it's only after the official dealing date, because again, it's kind of reinforced the statement earlier that international price really drove the NZU prices. So, and also the second interesting thing here is a negative sign, because in a lot of literature, they found that the energy price and NZU or the carbon prices, they go in the same way. Here is going in an opposite way. Well, it's highly actually likely here in New Zealand context, because New Zealand is highly reliant on clean energy. So when clean energy doesn't require any allowances, so when they have the higher price to higher electricity price, draw more renewable generation, they actually don't need that much allowances to be compliant. So that makes sense, and that drives down the NZU price. So it just makes sense that in the context of clean energy, in a context of like New Zealand with a highly clean energy mix, it's likely that they go different ways. And this table presents a quality effects of demand drivers related to H4. Earlier, we talked about the NZU prices, that's relationship to the electricity price, and that demand driver is more from a pricing proxy point of view. Now here we're looking at the real, a very direct proxy here, just purely the construction values, the manufacturing values, and the generation volumes, and also the travel emissions. So because we only have quarterly frequency data, so sample size is fairly small. So we cannot split the whole sample periods like we did previously. So, however, we did introduce some post-delink interaction terms to capture the similar idea. So in these terms, if you bear with me, in model 1 and model 2, these terms, when it says post, these terms are the interaction terms, and in model 1, model 2, this interaction terms correspond to the official delink date. That's May 31st, 2015. Model 3, model 4, model 5, it's the interaction terms. Actually, they lose their significance here, but they correspond to the actual delink date. So mainly, I think it would be good just focus on model 1 and model 2, because 3, 4, and 5 actually shows that they actually don't respond that well to the actual delink date. So it's mainly the official delink date. What we see here, very interesting, there is a very interesting dynamics here. I have a good summary kind of table here. Before the delink date, the official delink date, the construction and manufacturing have a positive effect on NZU return. But after the delink date, it has a negative effect. And so this is kind of, the beginning was quite in line with our hypothesis, the positive effect demand driver should have positive effect on NZU return. But however, afterwards it turned negative. And it just implied that maybe there's some over allocation going on over time. And there's also a lot of discussion around, actually the government released a consultation paper this year around this issue, the over allocation. So what happens here is that there's in the allocation policy, related policy, they use fixed allocative baselines to calculate the amount of allocation dedicated to these industries, to the qualified industries. And some major ones that lie in the manufacturing construction. So at the beginning it's good, but to protect their business, but then as time goes by, their efficiency goes up. So inevitably they don't need as many allocation anymore. So that just result in, but still maintaining the same allocative baselines will just result in over allocation over time. And let's move on to the stationary energy. Stationary energy from the beginning, before the D-link, it has a negative effect. And only after D-link, it has a positive effect. So this dynamic here, as I point out here, the implication here is that they probably have they exploited the unlimited international offset provision. So when during the linking period, this sector probably have bought a lot of units from the international market. At that time was very cheap, or even from and then they put it in their private stockpile, and they kept holding on to that, and even till only until after the D-link, when the international source of supply was no longer available, it seems that their behavior started to return to normal. That is, their demand actually has a positive effect on NZU price. So that means that the carbon pricing is working on the sector. So there's and then come to the transport sector. The before D-link is positive, and after D-link, it doesn't show in our model here. It may not respond that well to our model here. Model 3, 4, and 5 is using the actual D-link date. That's 2015, the fourth quarter. And we can just simply see here they're all positive related. However, like I said earlier before, just because these subsectors, they don't respond that well to the actual D-link date in our model. And this one is the last one. The result is with a monthly data set, and it tells us the monthly effects of supply drivers related to H2 over different horizon. This one, how it different from the daily result table is that this one has a breakdown of the domestic supply. I just want to drill into the pricing power of the allocation and the entitlements. That's the forestry sectors. So model 3 and 5, so that's the allocation. We see it plays a negative role, which is consistent with our hypothesis, and should be so. Supply drives down the price. And the 1, 2, 4 here, the green offsets or the entitlements here, interestingly have a positive effect on the NZU price, and that's before the actual D-link date. So because it should be negative, but then become positive. However, it's a 1 month lag. So it remains a little bit puzzle here, as I was discussing with my other supervisor co-authors, but I felt probably it just tells that when a month earlier, they kind of signal to the market what the price of NZU would be like. So they go positively. And then after the actual D-link, the NZU price keep rising. So the forester may not want to harvest the forest. So they just keep holding on to that instead of selling it to the market and play as a source of supply. So it never has a negative effect shown in the model. However, I do invite any comments or those who have expertise in this forestry sector in New Zealand context. And model 124 is just reinforce what we mentioned earlier, that before the actual dealing date, the net import has a negative effect on NZU return. And with that, it comes to my conclusion. A quick conclusion is that there are two structural breakpoints around these important policy events. One is on Feb 19th, 2013, following a large ban on international units with low environmental integrity. And the other one is on June 21st, 2016, following the announcement of gradual phasing out of 142 transitional measures. And so H2, H3F is mainly regarding the major supply drivers. These major supply drivers, they have negative effect on NZU return, but over different horizons. For international offset, they negatively affect before the actual dealing date. Domestic supply is after the actual official dealing date, and the bank units between the official and actual dealing dates. The last one is the major demand drivers have significant relationships with NZU returns with different dynamics. And so manufacturing and construction activities shift to negatively affect NZU returns after the official dealing date. This implies that the fixed allocative baseline may have resulted in over-allocation over time. And the government is working on that now as well to address this issue. Stationary energy, lastly, stationary energy sectoral activities shifted from negatively to positively affecting NZU returns after the official dealing date. And this is probably due to the exploitation of unlimited international offset during the linking period. And good thing is that we already moved out of that linking period. However, it may still happen in future, as in the legal document that the government still, if provision allows, the situation allows, it may still link back to the market. But it just, when it happens, we need to consider more about all this sort of policy, how it's gonna affect sectors like stationary energy sector. And with that, that's my thank you for your time. This is all my presentation. And if you have any comments or questions, please send to my my email address. I'm more than happy to see your thoughts and to discuss with you further. With that, back to you, Rebecca.
IAEE wishes to thank Ling Liao for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you're not a member of IAEE, we encourage you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.